The day my daughter told me I was no longer welcome in my own home, I was standing in my kitchen making her favorite peach cobbler. I remember the smell of brown sugar and cinnamon filling the air, the way the afternoon light came through the window above the sink, the same window my husband Robert had installed 31 years ago, because I told him I wanted to see the backyard while I cooked. I remember all of it, because some moments burn themselves into your memory whether you want them to or not. My daughter was sitting at the kitchen table, watching me work, and she said it so casually, like she was commenting on the weather. "Mom, my husband and I have been talking. We really think it's time you considered moving into something smaller, something more manageable. For someone your age." I was 67 years old. I had just come back from a 5-mile walk. I had just filed my own taxes, managed my own investments, and driven myself to every doctor's appointment I'd had in the 3 years since Robert passed, but standing there with a wooden spoon in my hand. Something in her voice told me this conversation was not going to end at something smaller. I was right. It was only the beginning. My name is Margaret, and I want to tell you what happened after that afternoon in my kitchen, because if you have children, if you have a home you built with someone you loved, if you have ever been made to feel like your age makes you a burden rather than a person, then this story is for you. Follow along until the end. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? Robert and I built our life in Asheville, North Carolina. We moved there in 1987, newly married, with almost nothing to our names except 2 teaching salaries and the kind of optimism that only young people in love can sustain. Robert taught high school history. I taught 4th grade for 34 years. We saved every dollar we could, bought a modest house on Clover Hill Road, and spent the next 3 decades turning it into something that felt like a real home. We raised our daughter Claire there. We buried both of our dogs in the backyard under the oak tree. We hosted Thanksgiving every year for 22 years straight. And Robert made the same terrible joke about the turkey being almost as well read as my students every single time, and every single time I laughed because it still made me happy to see him happy. Robert died 3 years ago, a stroke, sudden and total, on a Tuesday morning in March. He was in the backyard raking leaves when it happened, and by the time I reached him it was already too late. I won't go into the details of those first months without him because they belong to me, and some grief is too private to share. What I will tell you is that I survived. I kept the house. I kept myself. I kept going, because that is what you do when you love someone and then lose them, you carry them forward with you. Claire is my only child. She is 41 years old, lives 40 minutes away in Hendersonville, and is married to a man named Derek who works in real estate development. They have 2 children, my grandchildren, whom I love more than I can properly express. For the first year after Robert died, Claire called me every day. She came by on Sundays. She was attentive and kind, and I was grateful. Then Derek started coming to Sunday visits. I want to be fair. I don't think my daughter is a bad person. I don't think she woke up one morning and decided to be cruel. What I think happened is that she married a man who saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities, and slowly, the way water shapes stone, his way of seeing things became her way too. By the 2nd year after Robert's death, Claire had stopped asking how I was feeling and started asking how much the house was worth. "Have you thought about getting an appraisal?" she asked me one Sunday. "What would I need an appraisal for?" I said. "I'm not selling." She smiled the way you smile at a child who doesn't understand something. "I just mean it's good to know these things, Mom. For planning purposes." I let it go. I should not have let it go. Over the following months, the comments became more frequent and more pointed. The house was too big for one person. The stairs were dangerous for someone my age. The neighborhood had changed, and wasn't I nervous living alone? Derek mentioned, more than once, that property values in Asheville were at a historic high and that I would be leaving money on the table if I didn't act soon. He said it the way people say things they have rehearsed. One Sunday in October, almost 2 years after Robert died, Claire sat down across from me at the kitchen table and told me that she and Derek had found a lovely senior living community in Hendersonville. Independent living, she called it. She had a brochure. She slid it across the table like a contract. "We toured it last week," she said. "We think you'd really love it, Mom. There's a pool. And they have a garden club." I looked at the brochure. Then I looked at my daughter. Did you tour it before or after you talked to me about whether I wanted to move? She had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. We just wanted to see if it was a good option before bringing it up. And what would happen to the house? I asked. She glanced toward the kitchen doorway, where Derek was standing with his coffee cup. Something passed between them quick, almost invisible. I had been a fourth-grade teacher for 34 years. I knew how to read a room, we thought, Claire said carefully. That it might make sense for us to move in here. The kids could have more space, and you'd be taken care of. There it was. I told her I would think about it. I had no intention of thinking about it. But I also realized, in that moment, that I needed to start paying very close attention. I called my oldest friend, a woman named Ruth, that same evening. Ruth and I had been friends since our first year of teaching, 1979, when we were assigned classrooms next to each other and bonded over terrible coffee and the particular madness of November in an elementary school. She was 70 now, sharp as a tack, and she had an instinct for people that I had come to trust completely. I told her everything. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Maggie. She said she is the only person who still calls me that. How much is the house worth? I don't know exactly. The neighborhood has gone up. Find out, she said, and then call your attorney. I had an attorney, a man named Howard Gaines, who had handled Robert's estate when he passed. He was in his late 60s, semi-retired, the kind of man who wore the same 3 sport coats in rotation and remembered every detail of every case he had ever handled. Robert had trusted him completely, which meant I trusted him completely. I called Howard the next morning. He asked me to come in. I did. I told him what Claire and Derek had been saying, about the house, about the senior living community, about the way Derek looked at my kitchen like he was already measuring it for renovations. Howard listened with his hands folded on his desk. Has anyone mentioned your mental capacity? He asked. Questioned your ability to make decisions? Not yet, I said. They will, he said. And the certainty in his voice frightened me. He was right about that too. In November, Claire called to tell me she had made me an appointment with a specialist. A geriatric psychiatrist, she said, for a cognitive assessment. Just to establish a baseline, she said. Just to make sure everything was okay. I didn't ask for an appointment, I said. Mom, it's not a big deal. It's just a checkup. A cognitive checkup that you scheduled without asking me, I said, at a specialist that you chose. She started talking about how she was worried about me, how I had seemed forgetful lately, how she just wanted to make sure I was okay. I let her talk. I wrote down the name of the specialist and the date of the appointment. Then I called Howard and told him what had happened. Don't go to that appointment, he said. Schedule your own, with a doctor of your choosing, as soon as possible. Get it on record before they can establish any narrative. I called my own doctor, a woman I had been seeing for 15 years, and asked her to refer me to a neuropsychologist for a complete cognitive evaluation. I had it done within 2 weeks. I scored, as my doctor put it, exceptionally well for any age, let alone yours. She wrote that in the report. I kept 3 copies. Meanwhile, Derek started dropping by the house unannounced. Always with a reasonable excuse he was in the neighborhood, he wanted to check if the gutters were clear. He thought he smelled something from the road and wanted to make sure the furnace was okay. Each time I let him in, offered him coffee, and watched him walk through my house with his eyes doing calculations I could practically hear. I started keeping a log. Date, time, what was said, who was present. Ruth suggested it. Howard confirmed it was a good idea. I bought a small notebook and kept it in my bedside table. In December, Claire called and told me that she thought I should give her power of attorney. For my protection, she said, in case something happened to me. She mentioned it casually, between asking about my Thanksgiving plans and whether I needed anything from the grocery store. I told her I already had arrangements in place. I did not tell her what they were. She pressed. Derek sent me an email with an attached article about elderly women living alone and the legal complications that could arise. I forwarded it to Howard. He called me back and said, very calmly, Margaret, I think it's time we made some changes to your estate documents. We spent 2 afternoons in his office in December. By the time we were finished, my affairs were arranged exactly the way I wanted them. My house was placed in a revocable living trust. The trust named a trustee who was not my daughter and not her husband. Robert's pension and my retirement accounts had beneficiary designations that were now updated and ironclad. There was a durable power of attorney for health care that named Ruth as my agent. There was a financial power of attorney that named Howard himself, with a successor he had recommended. Everything was documented. Everything was witnessed. Everything was legal. And then Claire told me she wasn't coming for Christmas. She called me on December 18th. She said she and Derek had decided to spend Christmas in Hendersonville with his family this year. She said it matter-of-factly, as if it were simply a scheduling decision, as if it had nothing to do with the fact that I had not agreed to move out, had not given her power of attorney, had not done any of the things she and Derek had been maneuvering toward for the past year. I said I understood. I told her I hoped she had a wonderful Christmas. Then I called Ruth and invited her for Christmas dinner. I called my neighbor Frank, a retired contractor who had been Robert's friend for decades and who had been quietly watching my situation with growing concern. I called my former teaching colleague Diane and her husband. I called Howard and his wife. I made a reservation for 8 at my own dining room table, bought a 14-pound turkey, and started planning a Christmas dinner. I want to tell you something about that period, those weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas, because I think it is important. I was not pretending to be fine. I was not performing strength for an audience. I was genuinely, quietly devastated by what was happening with my daughter. There were nights when I sat in Robert's chair in the living room and talked to him the way I still do sometimes, telling him what was going on, asking him what he would do. I cried. I was angry. I missed him with a physical ache that doesn't go away 3 years later, and some days never will. But I also knew, with a clarity that felt like it had been forged by everything hard in my life, that I was not going to lose my home. I was not going to be managed and maneuvered and made to feel confused and helpless in my own life. I had built something real here, with Robert, and I was going to protect it. Claire called on December 23rd. She said she had reconsidered. She said she wanted to come for Christmas after all. She said she missed me, and that she was sorry for the distance between us, and that she thought it would be good for the children to spend Christmas with their grandmother. I told her she was welcome. I told her dinner was at 3. I did not tell her who else was coming. Christmas morning was cold and clear, the mountains visible from every window of the house, the kind of day that reminds you why you chose to live somewhere. I had been cooking since 7. Ruth arrived at noon to help. Frank came at 1 with a bottle of wine and the quiet, solid presence of a man who had known me and Robert for 20 years. Diane and her husband arrived at 2. Howard and his wife at 2:30. Claire and Derek arrived at 2:45 with my grandchildren and a bottle of wine and expressions that shifted, almost imperceptibly, when they walked in and found the dining room full of people. Derek recovered first. He shook hands. He smiled. He accepted a glass of wine and moved through the room with the ease of someone who is always performing, always selling something. Claire hugged me and whispered in my ear, "I didn't know you were having a party." "Just family and friends," I said. "Come in. Sit down." Dinner was good. The children ran through the house and played in the backyard under the oak tree, the way children should on Christmas. Conversation moved around the table: Frank's renovation projects, Diane's retirement plans, Howard's and his wife's recent trip to Portugal. Derek was pleasant and engaged, and I watched him recalibrate in real time, figuring out who these people were, what their relationship was to me, what it meant that they were here. After dinner, after the plates were cleared and the children were settled in the living room with their Christmas gifts, Derek leaned back in his chair and looked at me with the smile he used when he was about to propose something he had decided was already settled. "Margaret," he said, "I know this isn't the easiest thing to bring up at Christmas, but Claire and I have actually been in contact with a real estate attorney. We've been looking at the process for, in the event that there were concerns about a parent's capacity to manage their own affairs, what that process looks like. Legally speaking." The table went quiet. Not because anyone was surprised exactly, but because it had been said out loud. Finally, in front of witnesses, and now it existed in the room with all of us. I looked at him. I looked at Claire, who was looking at the tablecloth. "That's interesting," I said. "Tell me more about what you found." He talked for several minutes. He talked about conservatorship. He talked about the house and its value and what it would mean, practically speaking, for my long-term care. He talked about how difficult it was to watch a parent struggle and how much he and Claire just wanted to make sure I was protected. He said the word protected 4 times. I counted. When he finished, I reached under my chair and brought out the manila envelope I had placed there before dinner. I set it on the table between us. I've done some research of my own, I said. Derek looked at the envelope, then at me, then at Howard, whom he had been introduced to as a family friend. Howard, Derek said carefully. What do you do? I'm an estate attorney, Howard said pleasantly. I've been Margaret's attorney for about 15 years. Robert's too, before he passed. Something moved across Derek's face, quick, like a shadow. I opened the envelope and took out the documents one at a time. The results of my cognitive evaluation, exceptional for any age. The trust documents placing my house in a structure that neither Claire nor Derek could access or challenge without extensive, expensive, and almost certainly unsuccessful legal action. The updated power of attorney documents, the beneficiary designations, and at the bottom, something I had added at Howard's suggestion, a detailed log, dates and times and verbatim notes of every conversation Derek and Claire had initiated about my house, my finances, my cognitive state, and my living arrangements, going back 14 months. I laid them out on the table like cards. I want to be very clear, I said, and my voice was steady, though my hands were not. I love my daughter. I love my grandchildren. I have never wanted anything except for this family to be healthy and honest with each other. But I am not confused. I am not declining. I am not a problem to be managed. This is my home. Robert and I built it together, and I will leave it when and how I choose. I looked at Claire. She was crying, quietly, looking at the documents on the table. I know that Derek has been the one driving this, I said. I believe that. And I need you to hear me, Claire. Really hear me. I am not angry. I am heartbroken, because you are my daughter, and somewhere in the last 2 years I lost you to someone else's agenda, and I want you back. But not like this. Never like this. The room was very quiet. Outside, I could hear my grandchildren laughing about something in the living room. Derek stood up. He said several things, none of which I will repeat, because they were the words of a man who had been caught and was reacting from embarrassment rather than conscience. He said the documents were probably not as airtight as I thought. He said a real judge would see through this. He said Howard should be careful about his professional obligations. Howard smiled, very calmly, and said, "You're welcome to consult an attorney." Derek left. He took the car. Claire stayed. The next 2 hours were the hardest of that whole year, harder in some ways than anything that had come before, because they were honest in a way that nothing had been honest in a very long time. Claire sat at my kitchen table and I made tea, and we talked. Really talked. In a way we had not talked since Robert was alive. She told me that Derek had convinced her, gradually, that I was not coping as well as I appeared to be, that living alone in a big house was dangerous and irresponsible, that she would be failing me as a daughter if she didn't intervene. She told me she had believed him because she was grieving too, because losing her father had frightened her in ways she hadn't fully processed, because it was easier to focus on what I might need than to sit with her own loss. I listened to all of it. I handed her tissues. I told her I understood, and I meant it. Because I did. He showed me articles, she said, about cognitive decline, about women your age, living alone. He made it seem so. She stopped. "I'm so sorry, Mom." "I know," I said. "The house," she started, "is mine," I said gently, "and it will be mine until I decide otherwise. And when I do decide otherwise, that will be my decision too." She nodded. She stayed for another hour, until Derek came back, more composed, and waited in the car. She hugged me at the door for a long time. "I have to figure some things out," she said. "I know," I said. "Take the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. That was 11 months ago. Derek and Claire are in marriage counseling now. Claire told me that herself, in February, when she came to visit alone for the first time in years. She said the Christmas conversation had made her see things she had been avoiding. She said she had talked to her own therapist about the last 2 years and what she had allowed to happen. She has come for Sunday dinner 3 times since then. We are careful with each other in ways we weren't before, but I think that carefulness might grow into something better than what we had, something more honest, more equal, more real. My grandchildren came for a week in the summer. We planted tomatoes in the garden. We sat under the oak tree in the evenings, and I told them stories about their grandfather, the same stories I will keep telling until I don't have breath left to tell them. The house is still mine. The trust is still in place. Howard checks in every few months. Ruth comes for coffee every Tuesday. I think about Robert a lot. I think about what he would say if he had been there that Christmas. Watching me lay those documents on the table, I think he would have been proud. Not because I won something, but because I didn't disappear. Because I stayed myself even when someone I loved was trying, however, inadvertently, to unmake me. There is a thing that happens to women of a certain age that I want to name directly, because I think naming it matters. The world begins to treat you as if your preferences are symptoms, as if your desire to stay in your own home is stubbornness, as if your confidence in your own mind is delusion, as if taking up space is somehow taking something from your children rather than simply living the life you earned. I am 68 years old. I walk 5 miles 3 times a week. I read 2 books a month. I manage my own finances, maintain my own home, and make my own decisions. I am not a problem. I am a person. And if anyone in your life is trying to make you forget that, I hope this story reminds you. No one gets to vote you out of your own life. Keep the documents. Keep the log. Keep the friends who tell you the truth. Find your Howard. Find your Ruth. Find your Frank. The people who have known you long enough to remember who you are when you forget. And stay. Stay in your home, your life, yourself. Stay until you genuinely choose something different. You earn the right to choose. If this story meant something to you, please leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, a mother, a sister, a friend who is being made to feel smaller than she is, share it with her today. I'll be here next week with another story. Until then, take care of yourself. You matter more than you know.